Hello and welcome to the Pages of Godlight Podcast. I'm your host, Christine Whitaker. Have you ever seen how sunlight breaks through a patch of trees and creates a circle of brightness that seems almost otherworldly? Like a sacred space, so illuminated the world seems to glow. C.S. Lewis described these as patches of Godlight. I have been a book lover ever since I learned to read, and when I pick up a book over and over, I see glimmers of meaning within the pages that stop me in my tracks and make me pause and take in what I've come upon, just like those spots of brilliant light. In this podcast, Pages of Godlight, my hope is in these conversations as we meet authors and creators and talk through the pages of books, you too will stumble upon bright spots of words and carefully delivered messages that open you up to experiencing the light that is all around us and waiting to be found. Welcome to Pages of Godlight. In this continued conversation with Naghmeh Abedini Panahi, we continue to talk about her compelling story, I Didn't Survive.
Iran, you and Saeed moved back to the States. Did you have kids yet? Did you have your kids
No,
yet?
so Saeed had never been outside of Iran.
Okay.
I had been a missionary there, married him. So for the first time, Saeed comes to the States.
And how many years were you in the States?
Oh, in
roughly?
Iran?
No, before. I'm just curious.
When I went to Iran, I was right after college-ish. So
over 10 years.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I was just getting
more
timeline
than-
of how long you were here and then how long you were in Iran.
Yeah, 14 years.
Okay.
About 13, 14 years. I had been in America, 9 years in Iran, and another 12, 13 years in America.
And then how many back in Iran before you moved back to the States? The second
2001 until 2005.
Okay.
4 years.
Okay.
So yes, 9 years, 13 years.
Right.
So actually, it's like half and half.
Yeah.
With
yeah,
the
that's
two,
what I
if
was
you add
trying
the
to
two. It was
figure that out. Okay.
Yeah, if you add the 4 years I was back as a missionary, it would be right around
Yeah,
my amount of time
interesting.
in Iran and U.S. was the same. Yeah, I came to Iran, applied for Saeed to get a marriage visa. We kept getting arrested. Saeed actually had a court date coming up, and we decided to leave. We felt like we weren't effective anymore. The Iranian government was arresting us so much that if we visited house churches, they would find out about them. And so we left at that time. When we left 2005, towards like November of 2005, I was pregnant with my daughter, Rebecca.
Okay.
And then came to America, gave birth to my son, Jacob, in 2008. And Saeed started going back to Iran in 2009 when Jacob was 1 year old. And then 2012, he was arrested again. So in 2009, when he went back, the Iranian government did arrest him.
Okay.
Didn't let him because he hadn't finished his court date. He kind of left in the middle of court, and fearing that they would put him in prison.
Right.
So when he went back, he didn't feel as afraid that time had passed.
Sure.
So when he went back, they put him under house arrest, but he signed a thing saying that he was not going to do anything with the house churches, that he was going to help with like humanitarian stuff, like
Okay.
orphanage. So that's why they allowed him to go back and forth.
Okay.
2012, Saeed kind of did start getting involved with the house churches again, and that's when he was arrested. And I was in America, and again, another turning point where my whole world just changed from... I'd kind of settled in as a full-time working mom and working full-time and being a mom full-time. And really it changed to advocacy. That's when God just kind of brought me to the world of advocacy. And a lot of people know my story based on those between 2012 to 2016, those years where I was advocating to get Saeed out of prison and also advocating for the persecuted Christians.
And really you were the reason eventually he got released, in the sense of like you were the voice and the push, because we all know with advocacy, there's a lot of deaf ears. There's a lot of, there's a lot of issues in the world,
There's
obviously,
a lot.
right?
I was told by other there was a Marine and there was a Marine that had been in prison even longer than Saeed. They said, how did you make a big deal out of this? Like,
Right.
we tried. No one wanted to cover this. It was God. He gave me a platform, which brings me back to Psalm 2, because as I was advocating, as I had seen suffering of the Christians, God gave me a platform to fight for them now at the UN and the world stage. But something else God gave me was I got to share the gospel to millions and hundreds of millions of people. The first time that God just, I was in tears was at the United Nations in Geneva, and I was talking about my husband is in prison in Iran because he believes that Jesus Christ died for his sin and whoever. So I was like, use that to share the gospel.
Yeah.
And I looked around, I'm seeing over 100 ambassadors in every language having their earphones on, hearing what I'm saying in their language. And I'm seeing translators on that glass.
Awesome.
And God was like, remember when you were 9. Remember when you were 9 and you asked
beautiful.
you asked to share the gospel with the nations. In this moment, you just shared the gospel to the nation. And it was like being broadcast like on TVs, and it was like the UN being broadcasted. And I had the UN president and the secretary right in front of me. And so that moment, God was like, I'm using this for the gospel. You've had a heart, like at the core of who I am, I'm an evangelist. Like that gives me passion. And so God's like, I'm giving you the desire of your heart. I'm using this imprisonment to give you a platform for the gospel and to give you a platform for the persecuted church. And ultimately, years later, towards the end of Saeed's imprisonment, God just really used Saeed's imprisonment to set me free, which is another twist in the story. Like you said, there's just so much with being an immigrant and war and persecuted church and,
a Muslim identity, a Christian identity,
just
Western to Middle Eastern, like there's just, and all of that's created who you are. It's like none of it is, it's not one thing. That's humanity,
it's not
right?
Simple, yeah. People want to make it a simple story.
I know.
A Hollywood story. It's like, it's our life. No one's life is that simple. We are so complicated from how we grew up. And so, there was a twist in my story, which is very complicated.
Before we get to that twist, just the last thing I want to talk about, because clearly Saeed was unjustly imprisoned for his faith, and he never renounced his faith, and he was in prison for 3.5 years and tortured during that time. So clearly this was a very, very difficult situation. And with all of your advocacy work, he is someone that, people are looking up to because he has not shied away from his faith. Clearly he has done mission work,
evangelism.
Exactly. So, he's this figure that people really have a lot of their heart and soul behind. They're praying for release. So
he's writing these amazing letters from prison, especially early on.
Right.
That is just for Rebecca's birthday, Jacob's, and I'm in tears. Like the first letter that he was able to smuggle to his parents when they had their first in-person visit, after he'd been through solitary and beating and torture. I just read that letter, and it's, I think, on the internet. I was just bawling, the things he'd written, the changes God was doing in him. And he was wrongly imprisoned. Their case against him, which later we were able to get a hold of those documents, was his Christianity. Right. So for a country to imprison someone based on what they believe, and Iran actually sits on the Human Rights Council, and until recently when they got kicked out, they sat on the Women's Human Rights Council. And so Iran actually says, we allow religious freedom. So for them to then imprison someone, he was wrongly imprisoned. He actually spent 3.5 years in prison, but another half a year was before he was imprisoned was house arrest. So we hadn't seen him for over 4 years.
Right.
And so, yes, that was wrong, that he was in prison, and it's wrong for any country, to be persecuting a religious minority. So
most people, like the story ends kind of there, is they know you from, passionately advocating for your husband's release.
And he's the father of my children.
Right. And your husband, the person you did missions work with, So I'll let you talk about the twist, but like, first of all, before you even say that, I mean, the courage, I think, even for you to tell your story and to come to the place where you could be honest about everything is something that I don't take for granted, because it's hard enough in the world to be honest about who we are, what we're going through.
There's so much judgment.
Our weakness, our flaws, our, all the vulnerability is like, and especially in the world today where there's so much ability with the freedom of information for people to just tear people apart.
Yeah.
I'm not saying
being vulnerable is opening yourself up to being
completely,
torn apart.
and so I do understand that, but I mean, so we're going to get to the complicated part, and I think for me, Naghmeh, it's like Christians do often. One thing we are guilty of often is being so black and white and so looking at things.
Either a person's bad or they're good.
Exactly.
Like, there's no middle.
We are all sinners, and we all are capable of God working through us too. But it's not your story is not an easy story to tell, and I think for Christians it's a hard story to hear, because especially for someone that prayed for Saeed and was like, so
involved.
invested, and you were part of the reason they felt so invested too,
yes,
right? Like,
I was the face, I was the voice.
Right.
People felt connected to me, and it was a grassroots movement. People, moms, stay-at-home moms, homeschool moms. This became, by the time Saeed got out, before he got out, September of 2015 was the last prayer vigil we did. There was over 1,000 cities in like 50 countries that were praying for him, that had prayer vigil at the same time. Every state capital in America on September 26th had a prayer vigil at the state capitol building at noon their time. And so many people invested time and money and calling their congressman, getting involved, and doing Endure for Saeed runs. And so many people, it's hard to get anyone excited for a cause. But to see there was a grassroots movement that had started, the Save Saeed movement, was so many people were invested, and Saeed had become a Christian hero. And so the twist was heartbreaking for everyone, including me, because I didn't see the twist coming. I was, in my mind, I was going to fight so hard, then he was going to come out and he was going to say, "You're the best wife ever. And we're going to have this amazing marriage, and we're going to be these superstar Christians traveling on private jets and speaking." And
right.
That
was not the case.
Nope.
And that was not the case for a long time.
Nope.
And I think there's, this.
And it was heartbreaking.
It is. And I think even for me, when I think about it, it's like, I think about like, so the twist is Saeed was abusing you from the very beginning. So, one twist people would think is like, oh, you've been tortured in prison, you come out of that, you have PTSD, you've done this to someone else. But that's not the case. This was happening way before.
The PTSD made it worse.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so, yes, and he did go through trauma, complete trauma. But, this pattern of behavior began very early in.
Well, from the day we met, I was...
And you were 23, which also, let's put that in perspective.
I was 23.
You're very young. Like, 23-year-olds are idealistic. And we don't know. Like, if you'd never been married, you probably didn't even really date that much, or I don't know.
I just wanted someone who was on fire for Jesus.
Right.
I didn't want this mediocre, go to work, come home, go to church on Sunday, maybe on Wednesday if you're really... I wanted, I'd read missionary books, and I wanted someone who was sold out, at the front lines of Christianity. And Saeed was that. He was an evangelist, and so that's what attracted me to him, because all I cared about in my 23, you don't think about anything else. I mean, you don't think about emotional maturity, or is there sign of red flags. I didn't even know what red flags were. I didn't even know the word narcissism or abuse. Abuse for me was like someone coming home and beating their wife every day. And it was very subtle where when we met, it was kind of like, oh, if you would, my looks were not, I didn't even know what red flags were. I didn't even know the word narcissism or abuse for me was like someone coming home and beating their wife every day. And so it was very subtle where when we met, it was kind of like, oh, if you would, I something. He never looked at me like, you're so beautiful. If we went out to lunch or dinner, his had eyes on other women. I'd be like, why are you looking at her? Oh, I think you should go evangelize there. But it was like, you could totally tell. He was like, but it was putting me down. You need to have a nose surgery. Your eyebrows need to look different. You need to remove your scar. And, oh, you're a little chubby. I was like a size 4. I don't think I was chubby, but it was like, oh, you're not, it just tearing me down. And then slowly isolating me from family. Oh, your sister has a spiritual problem. I see. Your mom, your dad. So without me even knowing, I'd been isolated from my family, and I had become, my self-esteem had become so low. I was piling on makeup to be like, if I woke up in the morning with no makeup, he'd be like, go put something on. Like, my natural face was not pretty for him. And so I became very insecure. And then my thoughts became, even he questioned like my thoughts, where I made my dad had been a businessman, taking me on business trips. I'd made deals. Like, I had been pretty confident in that area, and he questioned that. So I became very, so the abuse, if someone would have said that's abuse, I would have like, don't say that's abuse. So the beating didn't really start, it happened twice in our marriage. But the first time was the worst, when I was pregnant with my daughter, and we just left Iran, and I was unpacking. We just went to Dubai, and we were going to wait in Dubai for Said to get his visa and then come to America. And Said was always very particular about packing our suitcase and making it look very neat.
Okay.
And I was just like looking through for my pajamas, and I found it, and there was a mess. And at that time, when you're pregnant, you're just very tired and you're very moody. And he said, you've made a mess. And I said, who cares? Like, it was midnight. And before I know it, I'm like this close to death, like punch, kick. I have my body. I didn't even recognize. I was like, looked like a monster. I had bruises. I had bumps. I crawled into the bathroom and shut the door. If I hadn't crawled into the bathroom and shut the door, I don't know if I would have survived. And just like, couldn't believe, never apologized, said it was spiritual forces that kind of made him do it, the demonic forces, but never said, I'm sorry, ever. And at that time, I felt like I was damaged good, because I'd kind of been raised in the purity movement. If I kiss a guy, then I'm damaged goods. No one else would want me, so I'm stuck. And that's actually what had happened leading up to our marriage. Said had kind of, again, I wouldn't have seen that as kind of an abusive behavior, but kind of sexually aggressive, kind of kissing me and, just crossing certain sexual boundaries. And I was like, I'm tainted. I'm no good. There was a few times during our engagement where I tried to break it off, but then I was like, no one's going to want me. Like, I hadn't had sex, but there's sexual boundaries he'd crossed. And then now I'm pregnant with a child. I'm not going to like, and also Middle Eastern culture, I'm not going to divorce, and I'm not going to be a single mom. And so from that moment, I knew I had to submit to keep the marriage. So really, it never got that bad again. I was always walking on eggshells. I was hands and feet serving him. He was addicted to porn. So I was like, being the weight he wanted me to be, the makeup, the whatever, lingerie. So making sure he, like, his sexual needs were met, and the house was always clean, that it was always meal, like just trying to be the perfect wife, kids raised. And so I the second time, it was close to beating. My daughter was 10 months, and it was in America. I wasn't in Dubai. And I was actually, again, pregnant with my son, and he grabbed me, almost like slammed me against the wall. And I mean, it didn't get that bad. He actually, his parents were on a Zoom call, or not Zoom, it was a Skype call, and he didn't want them to see. So he actually took his computer and went to a different room. So in that time, I had a call time, because I went back to Dubai, where he had gotten to that point and almost killed me. So I called the police, and he was arrested, pled guilty. It was 2007, pled guilty to domestic abuse. And so, but again, I thought, okay, twice he was physical with me. I didn't like consider the punching, sometimes spitting at me, pushing like as a physical abuse, which was very demeaning. But so there was a little bit of shoving and pushing, but I wouldn't have said that was physical abuse. But there was so I wouldn't have said I was an abused wife at all.
I think also people don't realize that every cutting remark, every control mechanism, every isolation is something that changes how you think about yourself. So when you say it's not abuse, it's also like I don't feel worthy because you've even if it wasn't physical abuse, but every day of hearing I'm not good enough, I'm not this, I'm not that. Right. It changes the way you think about yourself, about others. And so, I think people can't empathize or
verbal
understand
abuse
that.
is powerful.
Yeah, for
the
sure.
Bible says your words have a power of death or life.
Right.
That's the Bible. So we can't minimize verbal abuse or emotional abuse or spiritual abuse. Like there's no bruises on you, but it's bruising you. It's impacting the way you think about yourself. It's impacting the way you're living your life. It's actually more powerful because I couldn't see those bruises. Like the first time he beat me, I thought, well, why am I feeling like I'm dying?
Yeah.
Why am I feeling like this? He hasn't even beat me. And you can't see the emotional, psychological, all of that.
Right.
But it's very powerful. Each word the Bible says, it's power.
For sure.
But we forget that. We downplay that part, which is, again, like, and the Bible says when you're angry, you've committed a murder. You don't even have to like touch a person. Like walking on eggshells around an angry person.
Right.
Is.
And I think, I want you to talk about this because I think about this from an outside person of like, I think you're in your own prison and Saeed's in prison and you are the voice advocating for his release, right? And I think people really cannot understand that, right? Like someone that is doing those things to you, how could you be this,
advocating for him?
Yeah, how could you be the passionate voice, which you were? I mean, literally to have all the TV you did, the rallies, like that was a lot of work you were doing as well as speaking. But you've also a little bit answered that in the sense of like seeing his case as a universal kind of case of the persecuted church. But also, maybe at that point you weren't admitting all these things to yourself of like what was going, or at least at that place where you could say the truth or feel, and again, all of this has to be a process. So maybe just talk to that a little bit for someone that.
Why did you fight for him?
Right. Like people that knew you as that voice and then were so confused and distraught and like.
That he had beat me before he'd even gone to prison. There was adultery and, the adultery, I hadn't accepted it. And he admitted the adultery that he'd committed throughout our marriage after he got released from the prison. He admitted it to like Franklin Graham and a few other people that told me. I had kind of suspected it in our marriage, but he always said, you're crazy, you're imagining things. So I actually believed him and I would go to a psychologist and, but later he confessed, and the whole time he was calling me crazy, he was cheating on me. But one thing I want to say, like you said, we're complex people. Someone's not evil or good. Saeed is not the same. Like we have David, right?
Yes.
Who murdered this
adultery.
Murdered like this lamb of a person who didn't want to even be with his wife and because of his loyalty to David. And he literally slaughtered a lamb, murdered, and committed adultery. But there was repentance.
Yeah.
We are all sinners. And if anything, I want to emphasize. And then you see Saul, who didn't do half as much. Okay, he started a sacrifice or incense, and he wasn't supposed to do it. But you compare adultery and murder to what Saul did, but there was no repentance. And God's like, I'm done with you. And he was supposed to kill all of the cattle, and he kept some of the good ones. But so you look at what Saul did. We're all sinners, but God is not about weighing our sin. It's about, do you have a heart of repentance, no matter what you've done?
Right.
And one thing that God really revealed, because I had to untangle all of this myself, I fought for him because I loved him. I drew boundaries with him because I loved him too. But one seems like love and one seems like hate, but they're all love. It's kind of like seeing the God of the Bible where he's harsh in some areas and you're thinking, that's not love, but it's love too.
Right.
So when I drew boundaries and I realized I've been in a really abusive marriage, that was also love for my husband.
Right.
And calling him to repentance. And one thing that I think people also, as Christ died for us while we were his enemies. Yet he requires repentance for that relationship. So yes, I was fighting. When I was fighting for Said, in a way I was fighting for someone who had hurt me. I wouldn't have put the word abuse. I would have said I had a hard marriage, but
Right.
who doesn't? I thought I grew up in America. He grew up in Iran. And we told a pastor that we have a lot of issues in our marriage in Iran. And he said, well, you come from two different cultures. It's like two rivers hitting each other. And so I always thought I have a hard marriage because I grew up in a different culture. He grew up in Iran. I grew up in America. And here's the father of my children. By the time Said went to prison, I was completely dependent on him. I was isolated from family and friends.
Right.
Said was controlling everything. He would tell me what makeup to wear, what clothes to wear. My closet was picked out by Said, what to eat, when my kids could have play date with who. So here's someone that was basically dictating every aspect of my life gone.
Yeah.
I didn't know what to do. I was beside myself.
Sure.
Who do I ask?
Right.
Like, what do I do today? And my first interview, which was on Fox News with Hannity, I remember talking and someone saying, wow, you're well-spoken. And someone else was like, you're so pretty. And I thought, what are you talking about? Because I've been put down so much.
Of course.
But when Said went to prison, I'm fighting for the father of my kids. I'm fighting for someone I loved.
Sure.
But in the process, God knew that what would get me out of my shell to fly would be to advocate for someone else.
Yeah.
So I got out of this place and became this, it's like a thing I was fighting for someone.
Right.
And in the process, my chains were being I was being set free.
Yeah.
And realizing my worth and value in God. And finally, I shared to someone about all the things that had been happening in my marriage and realized that, this is before Said was released.
Right.
I realized I'd been in an abusive marriage. And so, and also another part of the puzzle, which we will talk about the book in a lot more detail, was Said had gotten a smartphone inside of the prison. So now, the last year to a year and a half of his imprisonment, I am seeing who Said is, and he is still that abusive person calling me Jezebel and whore and worthless. But he's also worse. He has, I could see he had extreme paranoia and extreme PTSD where he saw me as his enemy. He thought he could see from his smartphone, social media, he's seeing Naghmeh's getting famous. He's meeting with Trump. He's meeting with Obama. He's like all this stuff she's getting in. I mean, I am meeting with Trump, Obama, and I am speaking at mega churches, like 30,000 person. Like he's seeing it and he's upset.
Right.
And so I tell him I don't have to travel if it's upsetting you. He's like, no, but you have to keep my story alive. Okay, but I'm traveling. So later I realized why he was calling me worthless and names, because he was seeing that I was starting to gain confidence and he still wanted me to advocate, but he wanted me to know I was worthless so that if he came out, he could still control me. He was seeing that he was losing that control. So it didn't make sense why, as I was laying down my life to get this man out of prison, he was attacking me. And I finally told the pastor about it. And that's when the pastor told me, hey, I am actually not just a pastor. I have a doctorate in I have a doctorate in psychology, and you're an abused wife. And so that's when, again, it was just everything changed. But that's the twist. It was hard for me to see. It's kind of like, maybe it's not 100% like that example, but it's in the last days, many will say to Jesus, I did miracles in your name. I prophesied in your name. There's all this good work, but Jesus is like, I never knew you. That thing is so confusing that someone could do so much for the kingdom, even miracles, making someone walk or opening blind eyes. But there could be a possibility, I'm not saying that's 100%, that there was even no relationship with Christ himself.
Right.
That's just shocking. And so for me, we don't know. Ultimately, God knows our heart. God knows everything. But yes, there was a Said I absolutely loved, who was an evangelist, who was a prayer warrior, who was a worshiper of God. I remember even comparing him to like David and the way he worshiped, jumped.
Sure.
And then there was a Said who was watching porn and was abusive and controlling and cruel. And you know, and so that's how complex we are. And so I was attacked by my Christian community because their hero was no longer spotless.
Sure. Right.
And so
that's the price of telling the truth sometimes, right? It's like you can't, you know, people aren't going to like what you have to say, and you know, and people don't want to believe it, you know, and that's so common. The narrative of abuse is like families that don't want to believe an uncle abused a child
or the father abused,
right? Because they know that person, they couldn't see how that person could do that, and you know, but that, you know, I think about people that have cases like that, and when their family doesn't believe them, or the people that, and in your case, even Christians that maybe you didn't know, that's still your body, you know, that's still your community.
Yeah.
And so when they come against you, it's heartbreaking on top of all the heartbreak that you've had.
The attack from the Iranian government, from radicals, was nothing like compared at all. Because you know that's the enemy, but when it's from within, when people who had your back are now saying, because they can't believe that like their hero is spotted, has some sin,
right?
Isn't like David as an adulteress, or because they can't believe that, so they are like, you're lying, you are this, you were cheating on him, that's why you threw him under the bus, and
right.
And so, yeah, it's interesting. People accuse me of something that, by grace of God, I was not tempted. Like, Said was my first everything, and to this day, I haven't dated anyone. And if some people accuse me of fame and money, I actually sold everything I had to get out of book deals and movie deals. I actually got poor trying to get rid of money in our life. And so people said, well, maybe you were advocating because you wanted to be rich. First of all, I didn't know when I started advocating that it would blow up like this.
Yeah.
I had no clue. No other story, like you said, had blown up. Like who picks? It's hard to get a country, or actually it was now countries, the world, to get. It was almost 1 billion people were reached with this story. So how can you get so many people involved in a story? You can't. It has to be a God thing. I didn't know it was going to be such a big story.
Right.
So I was accused of so many things, not by the outside, but from within.
Yeah.
And also, I think, is sometimes when we try to protect a structure, like a church or Christ, the cause of Christ, you try to silence people. But recently, I was reading in the where Nathaniel, I think, confronts David. Prophet Nathan, and he actually says, you did it in secret, but I'm going to expose it. And he says the secret, what you did was damaging the cause of Christ. You have now given cause for the enemies of God too. So it's the act that's actually damaging the cause of Christ, not exposing it.
Right.
It's the act itself that's being done in the secret. God is all about exposure. And so when this was exposed, you're damaging the cause of Christ. And so a lot of times we silence the victim to try to protect an institution. And that's so far from the heart of Christ.
Right.
God is like, if the institution falls, it falls. I came to die for the person. And so I was attacked at a time and I lost everything. I lost the dearest thing. I didn't care about money. I didn't care about being an advocate. The thing that was the most dear to me that I actually mourned over, as Abraham did over Isaac, and I handed it to God, it was when Said filed for divorce. Because I believed, once I stopped advocating for him, I really believed if I drew firm boundaries, because one of my best friends had drawn firm boundaries with her husband and he had repented, and now they had this amazing marriage. And actually when Said got released from prison, I asked my friend and her husband to come talk to him. So I wanted that testimony. So I firmly believed if I let go of advocacy and I drew firm boundaries and kind of trusted God, he was going to restore my marriage. So when I drew boundaries and he filed for divorce, I was devastated. That's not I mourned that marriage. I cried. I entered to a season of what I would call the wilderness. The Christian community had turned their back on me. Said had divorced me. I'd become a single mom, which is number one thing I was afraid of. I now had to provide for myself and the kids. There was just so much that every fear, being my kids not growing up without a dad.
Sure.
You hear the statistics, being a divorced person. It's like in my culture in the Middle East, that's like the red letter. It's like you are no longer, wanted. And so having to, for me, it wasn't even the loss of the Christian community. The worst thing and the most thing that I was afraid of losing was my marriage, and I lost, by boundaries.
Right.
I was trying to save it, but it just, to fight for someone so hard to get them out of a 10-year prison sentence.
Right.
They come out after 3.5 years. And then for them to go, oh, you drew boundaries? I'm done. Not even try to make it work. Not even go, okay, I'll go to counseling and for 1 month and say it didn't work. For him not to even try to fight for the marriage was the most devastating. It actually made me feel what he had said all through our marriage. I felt worthless. I was not worth fighting for. I was not worth, anything for him to even try to save our marriage or try to change in any way. And so that was the low moment in my life.
I can only imagine.
It was heartbreaking. I remember reading, I think it was Mandela or something, reading about one of these people, I think it might have been Mandela, his wife advocating for him and getting him out, and then him marrying someone else.
Yes.
And I remember saying, that is so sad. I remember in my 20s reading that, and that is so sad. And it happened in my own life. Advocating for someone, then being divorced, and then he actually brought the girl he had been cheating with me through our marriage to America. He got her, within 3 months she was in America and they were living together, and I was just bawling and crying and just devastated, but I would read stories like that and cry for the person, and then it was happening to me.
And I think that's also where we learn what redemption and restoration looks in situations where things can't go back to the way they were. There's things that happen to us in life that it is done. The marriage is done, or the job is done, or whatever the case may be.
You've grown up. You can't take those years back.
Right. But it's there still can be redemption. There still can be restoration. I think restoration doesn't mean it all comes back, but it means that there can be a sense of being whole again.
Yes.
And so I want to read the quote from the book that we called your book, I Didn't Survive. And I know that sounds funny, but listen to I'm going to read this passage and you can talk about it, because I think this really is a big part of who you became after you've gone through all these trials. So you say, I cannot tell you how I was able to make it through, because I didn't. The old me died in the process, burned in the fire of trials, and the new me emerged at the end. I am not the same person today as I was before. People who have a hard time getting out of abusive relationships are often those who attempt to drag their old self, their old way of thinking through it. I didn't, I couldn't. Like the phoenix rising from the ashes, the new me arose from the catastrophe of my marriage. So you had to let things go. And I honestly, it's like putting out the fleece sometimes. We have to let go of things for God to really bring clarity for what is to come. And it's not always the thing we choose. Sometimes that I've heard many stories of people letting go something and God then giving it to them.
And sometimes they don't.
But then sometimes they don't. But it's until we get to that point of not holding so
letting
tight.
go means you're really letting go. So if you don't get it back, you're still okay.
Right. Your hands are still open.
You're
right?
not. I did let go of my marriage, wanting it back, and when it didn't come back, I was devastated. When I drew boundaries, I told God, "I'm drawing boundaries, giving you my marriage, and I know you're going to give it back." And that was not the case. But there was redemption. Sometimes we don't think there is because we want redemption a certain way. Sorry.
No problem.
I think the letting go you're talking about is letting go of the result too.
Right.
Because a lot of people don't see my story as being redeemed because our family never came back together. But for me, there has been redemption. I'm a whole person. I have peace. I have joy. God has continued to use me in different ways and given me understanding about abuse and heartbreak that I would have never understood if I hadn't walked through it, and to help others. But for me, the redemption is I am a whole person. I can actually, many days I don't even wear makeup, and I can walk freely knowing that I'm a beautiful daughter of God, and I'm comfortable in my skin. When Saeed would call me fat, I was 30 pounds lighter than I am right now, but I'm okay with
Yes.
there is this freedom, and I feel beautiful, and I feel whole, and there's peace. There's so much peace and joy. And for me, that's the redemption.
Yeah.
And helping and seeing other women set free. And, so I think we can be anxious and sad when we are holding on to what that redemption should look like in our life. But when we let go and trust that we serve a good God, He cares about us, and we receive whatever that redemption and restoration looks like, then we can really find peace in that and closure in that. And I don't know how to, to this day, people are sad for me. They're like, oh, you haven't been married, you're somehow in our mind, it's like a woman who's single who's never been married, or a woman who's been divorced, or a woman who's never been able to have a child, or somehow we have this scenario of you have to have done this, right, and that to be whole. That's not true. You can actually have done all of that and be a very broken person. You can be married and a very broken, lonely person, but you can be single and not be lonely and be a very whole person. So we have this idea of what redemption looks like, but we have to really give that up. And for me, I haven't been this free and had so much peace and joy that I have right now. And God set me free. Now it would have been amazing if my husband had repented and we would have had a family unit. But outside of that, God is bigger than that. And the peace I have now, the confidence God has given me as His child is way more than when I was married. And it's beautiful. The bondage that has been lifted off of me, the oppression, for me, that's amazing.
And through this weird twist of fate, it's like God showed you your purpose. The advocacy you did for Saeed became that voice that you gained confidence, but you also felt the calling of what am I here for? And not that you're just here for that, but I'm saying that you found a voice.
He gave me a voice.
Yes.
Before Saeed's imprisonment, I didn't have a voice, and so kind of like a butterfly struggling through, the cocoon and becoming a butterfly. As I advocated for Saeed, I found that I had a voice, and I found that people listen to that voice.
Right.
To this day, I'm amazed when people message me, or I see people on the streets and they're like, Naghmeh, oh, you don't know me, but I'm so inspired. I'm like, they're inspired by me. But to know that God has given me a voice and He's using it, and advocacy, like you said, is a big part of not even realizing it, but now, over time, seeing that being an advocate is a big part of my calling. And so really I found my wings. God is like, here, fly where, God's ways and thoughts are so different. What seemed, we were like this amazing, picture perfect family with the Disney photo all over the world, when there was truly sadness, loneliness, and bondage in that family photo that no one saw, to where now it seems like I'm a single mom and all that, but there's true freedom, and God gave me wings to fly and then to help set other women free. And like you said, it kind of paved the way for my calling, for the calling He has for my life.
So I want to read this quote to you because I think you will really, I know we've read some of the same books, but I just thought this one really, so we both read the book, The Body Keeps the Score, which is about trauma and, how our bodies react. But I thought this quote you could speak to a little bit, and to me, it's very poignant, probably what you went through. But so, Bessel van der Kolk, I don't know if I'm saying his name right, but
Sounds Dutch.
yes, he wrote, it takes enormous trust and courage to all yourself to remember one of the hardest things for traumatized people is to confront their shame about the way they behave during a traumatic episode, whether it is objectively warranted or not. So I think there's a lot of truth to that. So like in moments where either abuse happened, arguing or a fight or something, it's like you take on this sense of what could I have done? Like I am that person he's saying I am, or I didn't react the way I should have. So it's like this almost shame on every angle. It's either the shame of I let this happen to me, or the shame of like I am this person that they're saying I am. Right?
Yes. It's and sometimes it's that shame of having, it's kind of like even sexually abused people have that bond with their abuser.
Yeah.
That, there's just so much confusion with abuse and trauma that how you're responding, sometimes you're almost protecting your abuser. You're, the way your body even like tries to process or bonds with that and the way you're going through the trauma. But a lot of a lot of my shame was, why didn't I see it?
Yeah.
Okay, when he beat me when I was pregnant with my daughter, like move on, like like feeling stupid and like you kind of expect abuse from uneducated people who don't know any better, but it actually happens to everyone. A lot of people, whether it's an intimate relationship or work or parent. But so for me, a lot of the shame was, especially also after I advocated for him, was why didn't I see that sooner? Like, why did this have to explode on a global stage? There was so much shame. I couldn't even go to church because I remember the first few weeks I would just walk into church and I could imagine what people were thinking in their heads about me. Oh, look at her. Oh, all of it, And so a lot of my shame and guilt was, why didn't I see it? It was so obvious. It was so obvious I was being abused. And why did I advocate? Like, why did I fight so hard? I could have just relaxed for 3.5 years and recover. And I had to sell property we had to get rid of my book deal, but I could have sold that property and just had a really good life. And enjoyed like time with my kids. I missed their age of when I advocated for sight. They were 4 and 5, and when I stopped, they were 9 and 10. I missed those little sweet little kindergarten, first grade years. And so, a lot of my shame was, why didn't I see it? Like feeling stupid. But like you said, a lot of it is also a lot of what they say you've accepted. That maybe I am stupid. I am worthless. Like I am all those things.
And I think that's also, certainly America is not patient people. Give it to me now, right? But with therapy and with overcoming something like, for multiple years of abuse, you need multiple years of therapy. You need time. As long as it took to like get you to that place, it almost takes that same amount of time to get you out of that place. And I think sometimes we're not patient enough to like, with ourselves and understanding that, when you go through something like that, it takes time to unpack it all, to realize some of the same thought patterns you're still having and carrying, the anxiety or whatever. And I'm sure that you still have a lot,
you're always unpacking something.
Sure. And it's still with you. I mean, you're even if you're whole, it doesn't mean you're not still dealing with things.
Oh, you are always, there's always, we do have to slow down in life. I think that's why Sabbath is so, like, you gotta, not just for a season, I think like even daily or weekly, like putting time aside to just think and process.
Right.
Not being busy all the time, and showing yourself grace as you process and with the mistakes. But also, I want to say, show those who've gone through trauma grace. I see with so many, for example, sexually abused victims, why didn't you report it?
Right.
Most people don't report it. Then they get blamed because they didn't.
Right.
There's so much going through their minds of shame and could I have stopped it? Maybe I was part of the problem. And so I would say for person dealing with trauma to give yourself grace to untangle, but also from those on the outside, like don't be quick to say, well, I would have done this, this, and this. You don't know.
Right.
You haven't walked through the trauma to say, to know what you would have done.
Right.
Your body reacts differently than when you're outside of that and thinking, and so there's so many different factors to be able to really pull back from trying to comment and kind of letting the person who's walked through the trauma, even with people coming out of domestic abuse, you should never force them to leave their abuser. They have to reach that point themselves. You don't want to be the abuser, controlling them.
Right.
So you have to let them process the abuse as they get educated. And then usually it's after the 7th time where they've gone back to the abuse and come back and gone back after the 7th time. Usually it's the time where they finally walk away. But you got to have grace and patience for this trauma victim, for this person to process it on their own time and their own way to break free and not be, well, why did you fight for him? Why didn't you report it to the police? Why didn't you,
Yes.
That can wound someone so much when you do that. And because they're already feeling stupid and dumb and all of that for not having reported it or done this, and that.
Right.
And so I just would say really being sensitive to people who've gone through trauma and becoming more of a listener than like saying things that could cause even a deeper wound.
And that's that's the beauty I see of your life, Naghmeh, is that we were talking earlier about how you do advocacy work, you help refugees, you help the persecuted church, you help abused women. You're not any one of those things, but yet you have been through all of those things.
Yeah, people are like, why do you work with refugees? I'm like, because that's part of my story.
Right.
Why do you work with the persecuted church? That's also part of my story.
Right. Yeah. And I think sometimes I feel like the only silver lining you could take away from the worst, darkest things that happen to people is that if someone else goes through it, you can walk beside them in a way no one else can. We all can speak encouragement. We can help people, even if we've not been through it. But God uses people that distinctly know the feelings, know where they were at the same time.
Walk through the
exactly.
same,
And that's the beauty of trauma and the thing that we can take, the good that can come out of the bad, is that you can reach other people.
Yes, that maybe others couldn't reach.
Exactly. And that's when you see how God works. And I think, and the other beautiful thing I see, Naghmeh, is for anyone that would have gone through all that you did and seen hypocrisy and seen the ups and downs, the burns from the church and all of that, to continue to say Christ is love and is good and is my God, and to carry your faith as that thread through all of the interweaving. Yeah. You have that one singular thread that didn't break, Sure, maybe it bent sometimes, but it didn't break. And I think I think people can take so much peace from that, because there is struggle in faith and trying to figure out this world where, someone that did this wonderful thing also did this terrible thing. And how do we understand?
Yes. How does it, I guess it shakes a lot of people's faith, but I think it can also make it stronger.
Sure.
And so to be able to fight, be the one, for a lot of times, through a lot of these confusion, Christian heroes of mine turning their back on me, or even like a hero like Saeed doing this amazing stuff, and a lot is just holding on to the cloak of Jesus and saying, I have nowhere else to go. Like, this is not making sense. This is really painful. But like Peter, I got nowhere else to go. Like, all these disciples left Christ when he said, you have to drink of my blood. And Peter's like, Jesus is like, do you guys want to go? And Peter's like, no, I got nowhere else. So for me, it's been just in those times of extreme pain, not making sense of it all, clinging to Jesus and saying, I got nowhere else to go. We got to work this through. Like, and he has shown that what was taught to me, what I was taught was not who he is. Institution does not trump a person's well-being. It's always about loving the person. And Jesus is all about the person. And if someone says, we got to save the marriage, it doesn't matter what happens to you, that's not who Christ is. Or we got to save a church, so don't say that this pastor has been sexually abusing you because it's going to ruin the church. God's about that one sheep that was abused, using his name, using an authority as a pastor. And I think part of God's redemption has not just been that God has used my story to help others, but I like who I am now than I was in my 20s. Like in my 20s, I wasn't broken. I'd gone through stuff, but there's something about abuse that really broke me. So if someone had lost a child or was dealing with an illness and they would tell me, I'd be like, I'm so sorry. Or I'd watch a really sad movie. I'd be like, but now I'm like weeping, I'm understanding. Right. And so God has really given me a compassionate heart and just shaped through all these trials. I can say I like how he's been molding me, and I like the person I am now more than the person I was in my 20s. Even though it's like a lot of fire and and even where I am with my relationship with the Lord, the trust that has come out of that, just a lot of beautiful things have come out of that in this world it might not seem like I, fit the narrative of what success would be, but spiritually especially, I can see things that the journey I've walked, the sanctification, the growth, my relationship with God, I wouldn't trade that for anything. And if I was to walk through all of that again, like the war in Iran is what brought me to Christ. Like we had to leave. Yeah. And then, so a lot of the things or Saeed's imprisonment made me have to like step out and advocate. When I felt worthless and stupid and dumb and not well-spoken, all of a sudden as I'm advocating, God is building this confidence and freeing me. So something so bad actually ended up for my good. Right. A war so bad in Iran actually led me to finding Christ. And so that's the redemption is just, I would go through all of that again. If the war in Iran was what brought me to Christ, then it's okay that I went through that.
Yes. So we're going to wrap this up, but there's so many more things. and it's funny, the quote that I wanted to read you, it's very short, but I feel like this actually summarizes your entire book and how you can write this story now with a little bit of distance from what happened and being able to process it and then tell it from not only knowing who you were in those moments of shame, guilt, whatever, but now knowing from a different side, a confident you, knowing what your purpose is and how God has molded you. But this is from another book we both have read, Women Talking, but it's such a simple quote, but it's so poignant. And this is from Miriam Toe. She says, when we have been liberated ourselves, we will have to ask ourselves who we are. And I think this whole book is that question of who am I? But you could only ask that when you are free to say who I am, because when you are under control or abuse, you couldn't be your own. Like you couldn't have your own thoughts. And I think even that feeling of like, what do I do when someone has taken over my life? You probably didn't even know what you liked or didn't like.
Exactly.
And
what do I like to eat?
You had to relearn who you were. Yes. And that whole I didn't survive. Exactly. Well, yeah, that identity of like, I don't know who I am, that didn't survive. Now you know who you are.
You had to kind of go through the fire. And like you said in the book, a new me had to emerge. Like I couldn't pull that old self with the old thoughts and dependencies through where I am now. Yes. Which is, like you said, summarizes the book.
And funny, I picked a scripture for you too, Naghmeh, and it's in Psalms. It's not one or two, so don't worry. But this I felt like also is like, it is the beauty of you telling truth, even in a difficult situation. So Psalms 15, 1 and 2 says, Lord, who may dwell in your sacred tent? Who may live on your holy mountain? The one whose walk is blameless, who does what is righteous, and who speaks truth from their heart. And I think that's what you've done, spoken truth from your heart. And I believe that when we do that, people are changed. God uses that. So I know your story is not just about you. It's about reaching whoever that may be. It might be a man or a woman, you know, in the Middle East. It might be someone down your street. But exactly. But I know that God will use not only who you are and speaking pain and speaking through the redemption, but the advocacy work you do is so needed in this world. And I hear your voice, and it's a strong voice, and it's a voice that's gone through a lot. And so I just applaud your courage to be honest and to even put this book out and tell your story, because being vulnerable is not easy, but God uses that in ways we can't even imagine. So thank you for being with us. It was wonderful to have you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Pages of Godlight. To find out more information about the books we feature in each episode and the authors behind them, visit pagesofgodlight.com. Let there be abundant light.